Welcome back to the Beesness, honeys. I've got all your headlines here for Sunday the 10th through Saturday the 16th. All set, ready to go. The best of the buzz, handpicked and hand-curated by yours truly. A very small plug for/reminder about the fact that we have a Patreon page as well as a Substack page. Feel free to check out the content that we have posted there for you. And without further ado, let's begin. Starting with some follow-ups, last week we learned that France made big asks in exchange for the Bayeux Tapestry. The Financial Times reported Wednesday of last week that French officials had lobbied for discounted or free entry for French citizens to its exhibit, a request that British negotiators dismissed as a quote-unquote try-on that was, quote, never going to happen, end quote, according to Arts News, who pointed out that even French museums rarely offer free or discounted entry to their own citizens. But these asks started to get even bigger, says the Financial Times, quote, they reportedly floated borrowing the Rosetta Stone, the British Museum's single most renowned artifact, end quote, but obviously failed in that. We also heard Midjourney's first response to the lawsuit brought forth by Disney and Universal to prevent AI training using their works. This response, unsurprisingly, centered on the concept of free use. In fact, Midjourney's lawyers said, quote, copyright law does not confer absolute control over the use of copyrighted works. The limited monopoly granted by copyright must give way to fair use, which safeguards countervailing public interests in the free flow of ideas and information, end quote. As Arts News writes that their response also noted that, quote, many dozens, end quote, of Midjourney's subscribers have Disney or Universal-linked email addresses, so it appears the studio's own employees are also using the service. Midjourney argued that Disney, quote-unquote, can't have it both ways, suing the AI service while allowing its visual effects companies to use its tools in their film productions. We will let you know if we hear a response to this response. One of our regular sources, HypeArt, also published an article last week titled The Slow Death of the Contemporary Art Gallery, and I think it's worth talking about. Its author discusses how, quote, dedicated spaces that once buzzed with foot traffic and formal openings are now struggling with rising rents and changing expectations. The old model, where a gallery does everything for its artists, feels like it's falling apart, end quote. And HypeArt says that the shift is visible in the results of major events. For example, Art Basel and UBS Art Market reported recently that galleries are not showing massive and ultra-expensive works as frequently, but rather mid-priced work. UBS also reported that the number of sales went up despite the overall market shrink last year. So, why is there a shift at all? The instant access of looking or buying art on our phones has basically replaced the old, quote, slow dance of white cube shows and champagne previews, end quote, as our sources put it. In other words, blue chip, or reliably, often institutionally built up artists, mostly old masters, are kind of out, and red chip, aka new talents with cultural diversity and relevance as well as accessibility, are in. There are other trends influencing these shifts as well. For example, celebrities entering the art market with their own work, a la Adrian Brody, and commanding high prices based on their existing fame. Though the Brody type is not always successful, HypeArt writes, quote, however, Brody's work has drawn sharp criticism from the industry. One critic writing for Art News described his work as having a, quote, faux naive aesthetic, end inner quote, and, quote, mediocre production value, end inner quote, while others have accused him of cheaply appropriating the styles of Jean-Michel Basquiat and Andy Warhol, end quote. Another factor is that smaller galleries are changing up their formats, their landscapes. We're seeing more immersive retail experiences bordering on galleries, a la South Korea's Gentle Monster or London's Cover Street. We have a different format example in Tiwa Gallery of New York, which rejects pushy marketing and shows self-taught artists in a more relaxed space. This article made a really important closing note. Art is not disappearing from the physical world, but it's moving through it very differently. Art is less geographically tied down than it ever has been, so the question is not about the survival of the gallery as a format, but rather which specific galleries will adapt best to the new conditions. Last week also brought the news that a rare first edition copy of The Hobbit found in an English home has sold for nearly $60,000 US. Staffers at the Bath auction house Auctioneum discovered the book while doing a quote-unquote run-of-the-mill bookcase inspection, sorting through the belongings of a recently deceased homeowner in Bristol. Experts estimated the book's value only at about £12,000 or $16,000 US. Tolkien expert Peter Collier tells The Times' Amelia Nierenberg, quote, "The idea that one sat untouched on a shelf for so many years without anyone realizing its value is not just unusual, it's astonishing," end quote, as first edition copies are rare, only numbering a few hundreds today. This one is imperfect, but in overall great condition. We also heard a new list of names has joined the Port Authority and JFK Millennium Partners' $22 million public art initiative, itself part of the $4.2 billion redevelopment of JFK's Airport Terminal 6 to transform that arrivals corridor into a mini New York arts district. That initiative will also feature 19 permanent site-specific works curated by the Public Art Fund, and these participating institutions include the MoMA, the Met, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Lincoln Center for Performing Arts, all of which will contribute major installations from their own collections and creative partnerships. In less happy news, however, the School of Visual Arts has quietly laid off some of its staff. The school's president, David Rhodes, announced the news in a brief all-staff email on August 5th, reviewed later by our sources. And the recently organized SVA faculty union told Hyperallergic that, based on informal discussions among colleagues, they believe approximately 30 individuals were laid off across all departments and under as well as graduate programs. The school itself cited, quote, "financial challenges," unquote, which have also allegedly resulted in canceled courses and budget shortfalls. We noticed this headline, honeys, because these cuts come barely 2 months after the nearly 1,200 faculty members of the Manhattan School officially unionized under United Auto Workers, a national labor group that also represents instructors at Columbia University, the Parsons School of Design, and in pursuit of, quote, "scheduled pay increases aligned with inflation, compensation for out-of-classroom labor, job security, and expanded benefits," unquote, say our sources. One of the SVA Faculty United UAW main organizers said to our sources that, quote, "We remain committed to the school's long-term success, but we are deeply disappointed that the administration has chosen to address financial challenges by laying off staff, canceling classes, and placing the burden squarely on its most valuable asset, its workers," end quote, as every course canceled directly impacts their wages, benefits, and future teaching opportunities. Also last week, the White House said that Smithsonian Museum exhibitions must, quote, "celebrate American exceptionalism," end quote. On August 12th, the Trump administration announced that it would conduct a comprehensive review of the Smithsonian Institution's current and forthcoming exhibitions, as well as programs like a folk festival and a block party at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, quote, "to assess tone, historical framing, and alignment with American ideals," end quote, ahead of the 250th anniversary celebrations. According to the letter sent by the White House to Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch and the reporting of Art Forum, quote, "institutions hosting exhibitions deemed problematic by the Trump administration will be given 120 days to replace," inner quotes, "divisive or ideologically driven language with unifying, historically accurate, and constructive descriptions," and all quotes. The Smithsonian Institution released a brief statement the next day confirming they would review the letter and will, quote, "continue to collaborate constructively," unquote, with other federal government entities. Its spokespeople did not clarify, however, whether the institution would accept the content revisions. And we had to report on this, honeys, because the letter marks the first public outline of an official government review of the institution by the current administration. Among many others with grave reactions was Samuel J. Redman, a history professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst with deep knowledge of the Smithsonian, who was quoted by our sources as saying to New York Times in regards to this headline, quote, "This is a full assault on the autonomy of all the different branches of the institution," end quote. On Thursday, August 14th, as California Governor Gavin Newsom conducted a press conference about congressional redistricting inside the building, dozens of masked federal agents descended on the Japanese American National Museum's plaza in Los Angeles. At least 75 agents, according to a JANM spokesperson, and at least one passerby was arrested. In an official statement afterwards, the museum's president and CEO, Ann Burroughs, said, quote, "We are outraged and deeply distressed that armed federal agents came onto our campus, making arrests on the very ground where, in 1942, Japanese American families were forced to board buses bound for concentration camps," end quote. Burroughs further pointed out parallels in the 1940s West Coast removal of Japanese families and today's ICE and CBP raids across the nation and said, quote, "It was a miscarriage of justice then, and it is a miscarriage of justice now," end quote. This headline matters because it brings up very complex and important, very imminent questions regarding safety, acceptance, agency, and/or institution rights, and the nuances of quote-unquote public space which surround these continued trespasses onto museums' properties by ICE, DHS, CBP, and others. Soon after the agency's intrusion, a video of Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass was made publicly available wherein she suggests that the agents were there as an act of political intimidation. The highly publicized event was, after all, promoting a special election that would create 5 new congressional districts in Texas as a counter to state Republicans' efforts to redistrict it in favor of conservatives, the efforts that Democrats fled the state 2 weeks ago to avoid having measures passing on. But Department of Homeland Security Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin denied that accusation in an ex post, saying the operation had nothing to do with Newsom or politics, but was, quote, about enforcing the law, end quote. All the same, the museum stated to our sources and other media that it would continue to follow the law and its existing policies, and if any further operations occurred, they would, quote, require a judicial warrant to access private spaces, end quote. Also last week, London's Imperial War Museum came under fire for refusing to change an information board in its Holocaust galleries that 2 eminent historians say is incorrect. The British news outlet Spectator explains that while this inaccuracy relating to the Nuremberg race laws passed by the Nazi regime in Germany in 1935 and presented by the museum may seem like a minor detail, quote, it reflects a growing pattern of soft Holocaust distortion. Not outright denial, but something subtler, a steady sanding down of uncomfortable truths, end quote, and thus is a serious misrepresentation with significant consequences. We also learned the Detroit Institute of Arts will debut its first major Native American art exhibition in over 3 decades. It will feature 90 works by more than 60 Anishinaabe artists from Michigan and the Great Lakes region, which will run from September 28th through April 8th of 2026. The Institute's assistant curator of Native American art, Denene De Quintal, said in a news release, quote, we have worked together to ensure that this exhibition represents the diversity and the dynamism of contemporary Anishinaabe art while honoring the cultural traditions from which these works originate, end quote. But we're having to do a little good news, bad news sandwiching today here because an Indigenous Museum also temporarily closed last week after whitewashing a mural. News of the closure comes after the Gitche-Gammon Indigenous Nations Museum in Evanston, Illinois, abruptly terminated its contract with an Indigenous artist over his, quote and inner quote, unauthorized, and inner quote, inclusion of pro-Palestine visuals and slogans in a preliminary underpainting for a commissioned mural outside the institution, end all quotes. Anishinaabe and Korean American artist Jamie John was commissioned by the museum to paint this outdoor mural honoring Anishinaabe culture. His final design paid homage to legendary figures like Sky Woman and Thunderbird, who play key roles in the Earth's formation in traditional Anishinaabe creation stories. That was approved in July and scheduled to be completed by August 18th. But in the creation/installation of the work, as in past ones of his, John featured pro-Palestine phrases and symbols such as protect immigrants, fund art, not weapons, as well as watermelons and doves, in order to create the mural's so-called doodle grid, or a common mural scaling technique in which an underpainting serves as a reference for the final work, like a sketch under an oil painting. But before John could finish covering that doodle grid, the museum ended the contract and painted over the work in progress. The museum's executive director, Kim Vieg, told the Evanston Roundtable that the doodle grid was a violation of the mural contract and, quote, did not align with the museum's focus, end quote, describing it as, again, quote, unauthorized. Said the artist to our sources for the day, quote, I am disappointed in the museum's lack of accountability to the Native community of Chicagoland, end quote. He added, quote, I agreed to the mural because I thought I was going to be doing good work for what I thought was a pillar of Chicago's Indigenous community, but I was betrayed and abandoned by an institution who censored, removed, and silenced the call for freedom to the Palestinian people, end quote. He also claimed he was not paid for any of his work at all, nor given the chance to speak to the board or defend himself in any way prior to the termination of this contract. Also last week, on Tuesday, Kim Kyon-hee, South Korea's ex-First Lady known for organizing exhibitions featuring artists like Andy Warhol and Mark Rothko, was arrested following a court-issued warrant on suspicions of her manipulating the stock price of Deutsche Motors between 2009 and 2012 and illegally interfering in the 2022 and 2024 election candidate nominations, all claims that she denies. The why we care here is that she will join her husband, former South Korean President President Yoon Suk Yeol in detention after he was arrested after attempting to impose martial law back in December. This is the first time, honeys, that a former presidential couple in South Korea has been detained simultaneously. And some good news for accessibility from last week. The art newspaper released a report that in the past decade, many museums, and they specifically shouted out one of my personal favorites, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, have expanded their translation efforts, particularly from English to Spanish, across wall labels, websites, signage, catalogs, video captions, in acknowledgement of the 43 million people, or about 14% of the U.S. population, who speak Spanish at home. We love to hear this, honeys. We love knowing that these efforts are opening the door to broader engagement and more learning opportunities. I regret to tell you, though, honeys, that David Chichkin, a Ukrainian artist who fought censorship, was killed at age 39 in battle. He died Monday of last week, and the Ukrainian Culture Ministry said that his heart stopped after he was wounded in battle against Russian troops. Chichkin had made national headlines in Ukraine time and again for mounting shows through the research initiative Libertarian Club of Underground Dialectics, which he founded in 2014, and which produced art about right-wing ideology and efforts to combat it. Chichkin's friend, filmmaker Alexei Redinsky, said, quote, David's military service deeply resonated with his lifelong and unwavering stance of resistance to any neo-fascist, imperialist, or chauvinist force, end quote. The National Gallery of Singapore also put out an ask for the public's cooperation in preserving an eggplant artwork. The piece, known as Still Life, first realized in 1992 by Suzanne Victor, is part of an ongoing survey exhibition and has proven irresistible to visitors who keep taking the fruits from the 200 eggplant installation off the wall. It's unclear how many have been removed, despite the gallery's previous denials of reports of, quote, continuous incidents, end quote, of touching the artwork. Of course, these being real vegetables, they sometimes need to be replaced, like when they spoil, but the artist herself explains there's some greater fascination going on here tempting the visitors to touch. Quote, it is as though they were seeing eggplants for the first time, as though these were some alien life form that has been ensconced on the wall for all to witness, end quote. Victor said that although she appreciates the staff's diligence, quote, the reality is that with public works, there are always limits to how much control can be exerted. These challenges highlight the delicate balance between preservation and the unpredictable nature of public engagement, which is, in itself, part of the ongoing conversation the work invites, end quote. Last week also saw Greenpeace activists unfurl a new Anish Kapoor work. In a dramatic protest created in collaboration with the artist, the activists waited for ideal weather, then approached a Shell-operated skiff gas rig 45 nautical miles off the coast of Norfolk in the North Sea on early Wednesday. They then climbed it to unfurl the 315-square-foot crimson-stained canvas down its side. The headline caught our attention because this installation is believed to be the first artwork ever displayed on an active gas extraction platform, and as the artist told The Guardian, quote, I call it butchered. It represents the butchering of our environment. At its core, it's blood on a canvas, a symbol of the destruction, the bleeding of our planet, and our very state of existence, end quote. The protest and the artwork received mixed reviews, and I'd like to quote Hyperallergic here, saying, does it add anything to the conversation? No. Did it piss off the oil and gas industry? Probably, so it can't be all bad, end quote. We also learned that a Voinovich mural, rediscovered in Kentucky after 4 decades, is being hidden again. The work in question is titled The Missing Children Show mural, created in 1985. It spans 2 walls of its home building and originally included installation elements. It has a pretty cool backstory as well. It was made while the artist traveled to Louisville, Kentucky to create site-specific murals as part of a week-long fundraiser, which was organized by a local art dealer to benefit the Kentucky Child Victims Trust Fund, along with 5 other New York artists, and with the understanding that their works would be destroyed not long after. But in 2023, the Voinovich Foundation received word saying that the late artist's mural had only been covered by a secondary wall, a false wall, not destroyed. Said the co-founder of PPOW, the New York gallery representing the Voinovich estate, in an emailed interview with our sources, quote, what is left is the largest known extant mural David ever created, densely packed with his signature imagery. The work also reflects David's enduring commitment to social justice and amplifying silenced voices. I think he took this commission very personally as a fundraiser for the Kentucky Child Victims Trust Fund, as he related to child abuse and trauma firsthand, end quote. However, the building's current leaseholder, a company named Zeo, wanted to operate it as they had intended, as a quote-unquote first-class gym. So they walled it back up the same way it had been prior for the mural's protection and conservation. collaboration. The company's chief creative director, Jamie Camposano, explained, quote, "This has been a very unique situation because if the mural has been on a canvas or a non-structural wall, we would have gladly handed it over to the foundation on day one. But unfortunately, that was not possible," end quote, and said the company was only obligated to protect it, not show it. The Wojnarowicz Foundation, of course, disagrees and believes that the work should be displayed. Said Isaac Alpert, PPOW's director of estates, to Art News, quote, "It's impossible to quantify what is lost when a major artwork is no longer viewable. Additionally, it cannot be overstated what it means for other individuals, artists, scholars, curators, to have visual proof of how David utilized his skills and practice in service to social justice. Especially in the context of the current political climate, it's important to have historical examples on which to build new movements that promote community building and collective action," end quote. We also learned that a massive, quote, "ugly and pornographic," end quote, mermaid statue will be officially removed from public view. The 13-foot-tall so-called Big Mermaid sculpture of Copenhagen has received continual criticism, most recently from critic Sorine Gottfredsen in the Danish newspaper Berlingske, who wrote, quote, "Erecting a statue of a man's hot dream of what a woman should look like is unlikely to promote many women's acceptance of their own bodies," end quote. The statue was supposedly inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid fairy tale, and she rather prominently displays her chest as she arches her back, leaning her head back. This statue is located within the Drager Fort, a protected monument, and so falls under the protection of the Danish Museum Act. Regardless, the Agency for Culture and Palaces said in a statement, quote, "In this context, the agency determined that alterations had been made to Drager Fort, including the installation of a large mermaid sculpture without prior permission. The agency has assessed that the sculpture disrupts the fortification's military structure and constitutes an element that is unfamiliar to the site," end quote, so it will be removed. But many, especially critics, are celebrating this choice as a win for women. Of course, we have one very special guy saying otherwise, Peter Beck, the Danish entrepreneur who is responsible for commissioning the piece and believes the boobs are basically just proportional. And our final story for the day, honeys, England's Norwich Castle has reopened following a $37 million restoration. After 5 years and those millions of dollars in work, visitors can now experience all 5 floors of the castle, including its basement and rooftop battlements, plus reconstructed medieval chambers, all of which have more than 900 artifacts on display. The director of the British Museum, Nicholas Cullenan, stressed the importance of close work with the Norfolk's Museum Service in making this happen, so yay fruitful collaborations. And that is our buzz for the week, honeys. Hope you've enjoyed. Hope you are continuing to find interesting things in the headlines we report to you. As always, we welcome your feedback wherever you're willing to provide it, whether that be subscribing, liking, commenting on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, wherever. We'll catch you next week with a new Beesness, and not too long after, we'll have a new 5-minute musical available through our Patreon. Until then, take care, hydrate or dihydrate. We'll talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.